Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are here for the AMR Certification Launch Program. We are really happy to have such a large and captive audience with us today. After 3 years of hard work in the making, we are finally at the point to launch the Mitigating Antimicrobial Resistance, AMR, certification program. For those who are not aware, we, BSI, British Standards Institution, are a global standards and business improvement company that enables organizations to turn standards into best practice into habits of excellence. This important topic of antimicrobial resistance and responsible production of antibiotics is playing a huge part in the healthcare system to really mitigate the resistance to key antibiotics through improving waste control in the manufacturing process. It speaks to BSI's purpose of inspiring trust for a more resilient world. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and we really are happy to have you here. I'm going to share my screen and do a few housekeeping rules really quick before we get started, and then we will jump into the meat of the presentation. So very first thing is the agenda. What are we going to be talking about today? So I will first do an introduction, like I have done with the purpose of the agenda and session today. We will also be joined by Steve Brooks, member of Secretariat for the AMR Industry Alliance Manufacturing Working Group. And that will be setting the scene of the AMR challenge and what the focus is for the program of work we are going to be talking about. The second session will be joined by Natasha Bambridge and Steve Brooks again, who will talk through a journey of how the certification program came to fruition and the progress that we have made and such action-oriented progress. Then we'll also go through a wonderful panel with my esteemed members of the Indian manufacturing community, and we will be joined by a number of representatives in the panel, and I will give a formal introduction to them in just a moment. And then finally, we'll also go through the technical certification process and what would actually be required to embark on certification for yourselves as manufacturers, or how you would use certification in a wider context, such as procurement of medicines or the financial investment into pharmaceutical industry. And then we'll also take a moment at the end for questions and answers. So thank you again for joining, and we're really looking forward to this exciting agenda. Two pieces of housekeeping rules, if I may ask of you all. Everyone has joined on mute in this session, so please funnel your questions and answers using the Q&A box on the right-hand side. I'll show you an image. The second is this session is being recorded, so we will use some information coming from this, so please be conscious of that. And also, as a follow-up to this session, we will be absolutely following up with an email and a copy of the recording for you to share with other stakeholders as you see fit. So you can see here is a quick image of the chat box. I wanted to just make sure everyone is aware of the chat box here on the screen. And please do, we have already received a number of questions in advance of the session, which we're very thankful for. But if you have not yet submitted a pre-question, then please use the chat box on the GoToWebinar platform. And I will then take those questions and facilitate it to the panel and also to the BSI team to answer at the end of the presentation today. So please do, we welcome this to be interactive. And I'm honored again to be joined by a number of esteemed colleagues from the Indian pharmaceutical industry and market, and really, really happy to have them all a part of today's session. So I'm going to really quickly run through each of the presenters' biographies so that you know the caliber of professionals that you have here on this screen. So I won't introduce myself but Courtney Soulsby is the Global Director of the Healthcare Sector team at BSI, and happy to be a part of this session and facilitating it with you. The second person that we are going to be hearing from is Steve Brooks. Steve Brooks is worked in the manufacturing industry for pharmaceutical for many years. He is the advisor to the AMR Antimicrobial Resistance Industry Alliance and chairs the manufacturing working group. Steve led Pfizer's global EHS organization and also assumed responsibility for business resiliency and environmental sustainability for the company. He was responsible for monitoring where appropriate and seeking influence from external environment on EHS matters of importance to Pfizer and also the broader biopharmaceutical industry. So thanks, Steve, for joining, and we're really happy to have you. And unfortunately missing from this slide, but not unimportant, is Natasha Bambridge, who is our Global Director for Consumer Promise Practice at BSI. And Natasha has over 20 years of experience in testing, inspection, and certification. She leads the BSI practice for Consumer Promise, which enables organizations to independently verify claims which impact consumers or patients, in this case, from servicing excellence through the topic of sustainability. So thanks for joining us, Natasha. And then also we have a number of representatives, like I mentioned, from the Indian market, which we're really happy to have here with us on the day today. So I'm going to really quickly take us through the panelists that will join the panel discussion and their bios today. So first and foremost, we have Vasudeva Murthy, who's our head of healthcare for BSI India. He's over 30 years of work experience within the pharmaceutical industry, 17 years working in management systems, awareness and implementation, looking at all topics from quality, safety, environment, and business continuity, but really is our go-to person for the pharmaceutical industry and BSI India, and has absolutely helped with the development of this AMR certification program. We're also joined by Mr. R.K. Agarwal, who's the president of Bulk Drug Manufacturing Association, and also the MD of Nakota's Chemicals. Mr. Agarwal is the chemical engineer with about 47 years of industrial experience, initially as a professional and last 30 years as an entrepreneur. So Mr. Agarwal is the managing director of the Bulk Drug Manufacturing Association and is the national president of that at this stage. Mr. Ashok Kumar Madan is also joined us today and is the executive director for the Indian Drug Manufacturers Association. And Mr. Ashok is an accomplished professional serving as executive director of the IDMA. He has extensive experience with the pharmaceutical industry, working for companies like GSK, Albert David, AstraZeneca, Unichem Laboratories, Baxter Healthcare, and on and on. He's got a huge amount of experience, and we're honored to have him here today. And then also, as the executive director of IDMA, Mr. Madan plays a crucial role in making sure that the interest of Indian drug manufacturing industry is represented through this trade body. He's responsible for leading and coordinating various initiatives for both interests of the association, including pharmaceutical companies operating in India, engaging with policymakers, regulatory bodies, government authorities to really advocate for policies that are favorable business for the environmental pharmaceutical sector. So thanks for joining, Mr. Ashok. Also, someone who's really helped and joined us along this journey for the AMR certification program, we have Manjeet Singh, who's the Director of Corporate Sustainability for Centriant Pharmaceuticals. And Manjeet Singh is absolutely a seasoned pharmaceutical professional with 37 years of rich experience in pharmaceutical operations. He's currently responsible for implementing the sustainability strategy for Centriant globally, addressing topics like SBTi target setting, greenhouse gas reduction, renewable energy, water stewardship, waste management, sustainable supply chains, and reporting. He's also key in combating the antimicrobial resistance program and implementing the AMR standard, which we'll talk about, to help achieve PNEC compliance and ultimately AMR certification. He's also really involved in the PSCI working group and the RAMP, Responsible Antibiotic Manufacturing Platform, and has worked in a number of different other bodies to help really foster environmental best practice within the pharmaceutical industry. And we also finally are also joined by Mr. Kushuk Samanta, and he is the head of Environment, Health and Safety for India for Viatris, and presently he's responsible for implementing the EHS initiatives across India and the rest of the world for Viatris as an organization. He's also drives the sustainability strategy across key initiatives and across the manufacturing locations in the region. He also is represented in the organization in the PSCI India subcommittee. He has a double master's in environment safety and engineering, with also an additional diploma in environmental law, and 3 decades of experience with water, wastewater management, sustainability, operation safety, and process safety within the pharmaceutical industry. So as you can see, we have a wide variety of speakers with deep technical expertise and also representative knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry on this topic and as a part of this agenda. So again, thank you very much for joining us, everyone, as the speakers, and we really very much look forward to having you on the panel discussion shortly. So with that, I'm going to really quickly pause and start with the first session of the conference today, and I will stop sharing my screen now and turn over to Steve Brooks to give a bit of a context to the antimicrobial resistance challenge and the industry. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Courtney, and it's a pleasure to join you this afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here with this esteemed group of very experienced professionals to talk about AMR and the work that we've been doing to get to this point to launch a certificate. But let me back up and really try and address in straightforward terms, hopefully, what is AMR, why is it important in regards to public health, and say a little bit about what's sort of happened on the political front and the what the industry's been doing over the last 10-15 years or so to address AMR. And then we'll get into the actual work of the Alliance regarding the certificate. So first of all, AMR, microbes, including most notably bacteria, but other microbes like viruses, that can infect humans. So we call them pathogens. Can become resistant to the treatments that we've become used to. When we get an infection, and when they become resistant, what happens is they no longer are effective as treatments. The treatments of for antibiotics are no longer effective when you get that infection. Either it doesn't work as well, the treatment doesn't work as well, or in the worst case, it doesn't work at all. Because the microorganisms developed a mechanism to protect itself against the antibiotic. Now, this is actually a natural phenomenon. It's a defense mechanism. But what's been happening is a great acceleration of the rate at which microbes and bacteria in particular are becoming resistant, because they're being exposed to a lot of different stresses in the environment in total. So it's not a new topic. It's been around since the beginning of time, but it's certainly a topic that's been very prominent in the last 15 or so years. And this is actually its prominence in public discussion, debate, and then policy discussions is important because it's beginning to help provide a necessary focus to address AMR, because left unchecked, it's going to wreak havoc around the world in all countries. Certainly, many of you in India will be familiar with it because there's very high rates of resistant infections in India. But it applies where I live in the United States as well, and any other country in the world actually will have cases of antimicrobial resistance. So resistance can come from the antibiotics being exposed, the bacteria, sorry, being exposed to antibiotics. And this exposure occurs in many different ways, but probably the most important is when you actually take an antibiotic, because there, of course, you've got the infectious microorganism and you've got the antibiotic present inside you, whether that's us as people or animals as well. And so the bacteria learn to adapt whenever we take antibiotics. And so there can be a big challenge when antibiotics are used inappropriately. They may be overused. They may be used for treatment of, say, a viral infection, when that actually will not do any good. But you you will develop some resistance because you're taking that antibiotic. They may be used in instances when, for example, in agriculture, when that may not be appropriate. In some countries, of course, there's challenges with how antibiotics are made available to people. So in a number of countries, they're through prescription only through a healthcare provider. In some countries, they're available readily over the counter. So our use and misuse of antibiotics is a really significant challenge. There's also ways in which we can become exposed to antibiotics, and the bacteria can become exposed to antibiotics, for example, through the food chain. So when we use antibiotics in agriculture, and then, and one of the reasons we're talking today is the environmental exposure that can occur. So bacteria in the environment can be exposed to a number of different stressors and can begin to mutate and develop resistance. And then those bacteria that develop resistance in the environment can transfer that resistance to pathogens, which you and I could be exposed to either through the water that we drink or otherwise come into contact with. So, and one of the sources of antibiotics in the environment is, of course, the manufacturing process. So if manufacturing isn't properly controlled, then there can be relatively high concentrations of antibiotics that find their way into the local environment, the rivers or water courses adjacent to manufacturing sites. And so those high concentrations can cause resistance to develop. So let me just tell you how significant the problem is. Back in 2016, there was a report in the UK, commissioned by the UK government, called the O'Neill Report, fairly well regarded as a seminal report on the importance of AMR. That report concluded that without significant steps to address AMR, up to 10 million people a year could die from resistant infections by 2050. That's not really that very far away. And in fact, they also looked at the economics associated with antimicrobial resistance in this report, and they estimated that up to $100 trillion could be lost to GDP in that same time frame by 2050. So those are very large numbers, and I think at the time there may have been some question as to how accurate those numbers really were. But if you look at COVID as a more recent example of a global health pandemic that caused significant havoc, it's estimated that between 10 and 20 million people have died as a result of COVID, and the economic loss is also in the 10 to 20 trillion dollar range. So it begins to tell us that these O'Neill numbers are not that, they're not that far-fetched. That the scale of AMR could really be very significant. And in fact, there's recent data published last year for the year 2019, published in the Lancet, where a review of death rates associated with AMR concluded that there were 1.3 million deaths around the world in 2019 directly attributable to AMR, and in fact a total of 5 million deaths where AMR was a factor in the death. So these are very, very large numbers, and they're concerning, of course, and the real concern is that things get worse before they get better. And if you think about this for a moment, you think about how reliant we are on antibiotics. If you have an infection, you would hope that you could get an antibiotic to treat it and quickly treat it. If you're going in for elective surgery, if you're having oncology treatment, oftentimes those treatments or surgeries are accompanied by prophylactic use of antibiotics. And if the antibiotics don't work, those surgeries become very, very high risk. So it's not just the the fact you can't treat infections when you've got them. It's the fact that a lot of the rest of the healthcare system is underpinned by our use of antibiotics. It's so important that we address the resistance issue. So the question is, what's industry been doing about this? Well, back in 2016, the industry, in recognition really of the fact that the United Nations were holding a General Assembly in New York, and we're going to focus on antimicrobial resistance, which was a really big deal. So there's only 3 times in history that the United Nations General Assembly has talked about health issues. So this was a very significant event. And in leading up to that, the industry made some commitments around R&D, what can be done to help improve the flow of new antibiotics into the marketplace. What can we do to ensure that how antibiotics are used, so that how can we improve their use so that they're used appropriately, and also accessibility, which is a big challenge, especially in some developing countries, where more people still today die from lack of access to antibiotics than from resistance. So they're dying from, we'll call it straightforward infectious diseases, and they can't get the treatments. So how can we address that? And finally, and bringing it right home to what we're doing, how can we control antibiotic emissions from manufacturing so that they're not part of this equation going forward? So the AMR Industry Alliance, who I represent, were formed in 2017 on the back of these commitments. And I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the alliance. So if you could just take me to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the alliance is one of the largest private sector coalitions focused on addressing AMR. We have about 100 members from the biotech, diagnostics, generics, and research-based pharmaceutical industry. I'll show you a slide in a minute with some logos that you'll probably recognize. And we've got certain commitments that I'll talk to momentarily to address AMR. But what's important about our work is we don't do it on our own. We collaborate with others in the public and private sectors. And in fact, our work that we're going to talk about today with BSI is a prime example of that. And the other thing that we do, and you can find online, is we report the progress that we've made against commitments that we set publicly across our membership. So you can, we're trying to demonstrate that we're taking action and improving over time. So if you go to the next slide, please. So we focus in 4 areas. They line up with the 4 areas that I just talked about. So we look at access, we look at appropriate use, we have work on the very important area of research and science, and we focus on our manufacturing. And in manufacturing, our work has been aimed at mitigating environmental impacts and advancing responsible manufacturing through standard setting. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that momentarily. The next slide shows you our members who are manufacturers of antibiotics. So what you will see here are some logos that I hope you will recognize. Some of you will work for these companies. You should see some very large pharmaceutical companies, some smaller pharmaceutical companies, and importantly, you'll see some geographic distribution of those companies. So we have companies, headquartered in the United States, in Europe, and of course in India. Through this grouping of companies, we represent approximately 1/3 of the antibiotics supplied to the human health marketplace by volume. So what that means is we're fairly large, and that usually gets us a seat at the table when people are talking about AMR and manufacturing. But the 30% figure is also just worth bearing in mind. I'll come back to it momentarily as we begin to talk about the journey that we're on. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So just click me through one more. Thank you. That's great. So having recognized this challenge that we've been talking about, this group of companies decided that in the absence of any regulation that controls antibiotic emissions, and don't get me wrong, there are plenty of regulations that govern the pharmaceutical industry. We are one of the most heavily regulated industries around. But there are no regulations in pretty much any country that specifically focus on the amount of antibiotic that can be contained in waste streams. We decided that we would develop an approach to set expectations for our members. So for those companies that you saw on that previous slide. And those expectations covered a management system, so an environmental management system, and importantly, the concentration of antibiotic that was felt to be acceptable to be in a waste stream. In other words, a concentration that we felt would not increase the risk of resistance in the environment. So we did that, and if you go to the next click on the slide, thank you. We developed an internal framework and a set of what we call PNECs, predicted no effect concentrations, and we've been working to implement those across our membership over several years now. But we took a step back and we went back to that 30% figure, and we said, hey, well, you know, even if all our members meet all these requirements, that's only 30% approximately of the supply chain. And oh, and by the way, that's only human health antibiotics. There's also animal health antibiotics and agricultural antibiotics. So we felt it would be better to develop something that might be able to apply across the entire antibiotic supply chain. And we reached out to the standards experts at BSI and said, can you help us? Can we develop a standard? Which we did and published in June of 2022, and that's available online, that basically converts what we had done for ourselves to make it applicable more broadly. So it's the management system and the PNECs. And importantly, can you develop an independent means to verify that a manufacturer is in fact making an antibiotic in accordance with the requirements of the standard? And that is the certification scheme that I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to be launching today. So I think I'm going to hand over to Natasha in just a moment. I just want to conclude my session by saying that this is a really important point in the journey. And I know BSI have been working with us for 3 years. This work's really probably been going in earnest for about 7 years. It's an exciting milestone, and it's very, very important. But it's only the beginning. It's really the end of the beginning. We're now at the point of launch, and launch means we need uptake. And we're going to hear a little bit more about why we think we're going to get uptake. But obviously, all of you on the call today, we're grateful to you for your interest in this, and we really hope that this will stimulate you to consider applying the standard and seeking certification. But let me now hand over to Natasha to complete this journey that we've been on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for that introduction. So one of the most important steps when we create a certification programme is where we utilise BSI's skills in convening the ecosystem on the topic. So when we do this, we bring together diverse technical subject matter experts so that we can get a broad range of views as we develop the certification scheme. We don't do that in isolation. So when we look at the ecosystem that we convene, it includes a whole variety of stakeholders. So we included leading manufacturers, independent assessors, academia, NGOs, government organisations, essentially for us to have representation across the full supply chain on this important topic. And what we did is use them as a sounding board and someone that we can develop the certification program, with their guidance. And we developed the assessment model itself, drawing on BSI's technical expertise in creating certification programs under the International Standard for Product Certification, which is ISO 17065. And we combined this with expertise that we have at BSI from BSI's environmental consulting body, where we've got extensive qualifications and experience, importantly, within the pharma manufacturing sector. And this consultation loop that we go through helps us to develop and enhance the scheme and improve the scheme and to use, as I said, the ecosystem as a sounding board. And after the draft document of the certification protocol has been completed, we continued these workshops with the stakeholder groups, and it was through this collaboration that we shaped the programme itself. And it then meant that we were ready to pilot, and you'll be hearing today from one of the participants of that pilot. Now, when we pilot a certification programme, our aim is that we're testing the assessment approach and the validation methods that we have built. And we want to confirm that they robustly demonstrate that an organisation can meet the requirements of the scheme, but also that they can meet them repeatedly into the future. It's an ongoing certification programme. So our starting point is defining, what do the parameters of the pilot look like? So again, we worked with our industry experts to ensure that we had representative industry scenarios and we were ready for deployment. So this meant that we needed to work across multiple geographies, so including India during the pilot process, for example. We wanted to work with large pharma organisations and also contract manufacturers, and we wanted to have representation both for using members from the Alliance itself, but also non-members of the Alliance through that process. And we wanted to see different products through that pilot process as well. So we wanted to look at APIs and the finished drug product, as well as where they were being manufactured together as well. We needed to see a representative range of manufacturers, their waste storage and their discharge. So we looked at different waste discharge methods as well, including zero liquid discharge, ZLD. And the validation of test evidence is also a really key part of this certification programme. So there was a great deal of time spent looking at different methods of PEC calculation so that we could define the evidence required so that auditors would be able to validate that data when they were conducting their assessment. And as with all pilots, it creates many learnings which lead to improvements, such as improving the guidance documentation that we're providing manufacturers with before they start the certification process, and also enhancements as well, such as including primary packaging within the assessment programme. So I'm delighted to share, and as Steve has said, that we're now in a position to deploy where any organisation can apply to become certified. So this really is the start of this programme, going on to have the impact that we truly believe that it can have. And it doesn't stop there when we launch a certification scheme. We continue to horizon scan. So both the standards owned by the AMR Industry Alliance and also the certification owned by BSI will continue to develop over time. It's really important to both of us that we're horizon scanning new methodologies and advances to support the wider industry in having a positive impact on this really key topic. So I'd like to hand back over now to Courtney.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Steve. A great representative of the journey that we've embarked on to get to where we are today. A lot of hard work, both from a number of different stakeholders, has gotten us here. So I think real quickly, I'll just go back to just do a little introduction to one slide on BSI, British Standards, just to ground ourselves in our independence and our understanding of our role as a certification body through this process. So the first thing I'll just mention is that almost all 4 divisions were a part of this development of the certification program. So the first division that we used to execute this certification was the standards development that Steve talked about earlier in this presentation. So we're conveners to institute best practice standards, and ultimately that's where BSI's role as a national standards body was the first part of this project where the standard was developed. We then are also a global assurance body. We have several offices across India, for example, and are to certify businesses to those standards and train individuals to implement those standards. So that's where our assurance body takes in, where really we understand assessment models and how you can deploy those against a range of technical expertise areas. We also are notified bodies. We act on behalf of the regulator in actually approving devices, medical devices, entering into markets, and so understand regulatory landscapes and where they impact with certification and voluntary certification. And then finally, we also are a consulting firm. So we have deep subject matter expertise in environment, health, safety, and sustainability, which were leveraged as part of the team that developed the assessment protocol for this certification as well. So just wanted to quickly talk through, I mean, ultimately those 4 statuses really represent our independence and our impartiality, and hopefully the trust that can then be instilled in the healthcare ecosystem as a result of this project. So the first thing I'm going to talk through in this section is the drivers of certification. So one of the things that I'm sure will come up in the Q&A is, why would Indian manufacturers embark on and become certified? And there are 3 main drivers, and I know Manjeet will touch on one of them at some point in his presentation, in his discussion on the panel as well. The first is specifiers from health systems. So we actually have 2 health systems, one confirmed, one in progress, to actually require the AMR certification, not only of the finished drug product brand names that are actually procuring antibiotics, but also of their supply chain. So the ones that produce the API that go into finished drug production. So that is actually now asking for, as the highest award criteria, evidence that antibiotic manufacturers and members of their supply chain have become certified to the AMR Industry Alliance standard. So that's one of the areas where at the very top of the chain, we have the health systems and the procurers of medicines, the global pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the members of the supply chain, the drivers starting at the very top through health system procurement and the commercial tenders for antibiotics, really specifying that the good environmental controls are in place when manufacturing antibiotics. The second set of drivers is from the financial investment community. The financial investment community has been in touch with the biopharma industry to produce guidance related to what are the key ESG principles that should be produced in sustainability reports. And the financial investment community has produced a guidance to biopharma organizations on the 12 top principles that should be included in ESG reports. And as you can see on the box here, of the 12 principles, first of all, AMR is called out as one of the 12, pharmaceuticals in the environment and antimicrobial resistance, you can see in red here. And then also supply chain management and environmental impacts are 2 of the others that are included. So very much the financial investment community is attaching green bonds for sustainability investment in the biopharma organizations, and AMR is one of those key principles that they're really focused on. So anyone who does become certified, I highly recommend you incorporate that in your sustainability or ESG reports to evidence as well for the financial investment community. The second and the final driver is obviously from the global pharmaceutical manufacturers themselves. So I'm sure all of us have been audited or been assessed through the BSI program, Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative. And those requirements are quite vast. They're, wide and maybe this deep. So it really highlights a number of different sets of requirements. This certification obviously is going to focus on 4 of those areas and asking about AMR, obviously, as the first focus. So you can see in the BSI requirements, it does ask about looking at the right discharge and wastewater management controls related to AMR and production of antibiotics specifically. So that's one of the requirements in BSI. In addition to management systems and training, which will be part of this certification. Natasha will touch on this briefly, but it asks if you have a management system for environmental controls as part of the BSI requirements, and also asks if your employees are trained to environmental topics. So both would be relevant as it relates to proof of how you're complying with the BSI requirements through becoming certified to AMR. And also finally, waste disposal and the vendors that you're using to actually take some of the waste into waste treatment facilities or ultimately possibly sludge even for incineration, that those waste disposal vendors, there's oversight of those as well. So I just really want to call out that, PSDI is the kind of broad set of requirements coming down from global pharmaceutical manufacturers, but this is one component where you can show deep expertise evidence of how you're complying with the topic of antimicrobial resistance by showcasing a certification as a mechanism. I know some global pharma companies are actually doing a really focused environmental audit only looking at antibiotic waste discharge processes now. So a really focused PI or AMR audit in addition to PSDI. So again, the AMR certification can be proof that you're complying with those sets of requirements. So I just wanted to touch on those three drivers, the financial investment community, the procurers of health systems, and the medicines they're procuring, and then finally, the global pharmaceutical companies themselves. So what is the value ultimately of this certification before we get into the panel and hear it hopefully from themselves as well? I think the first is there's finally a standard approach. A lot of people have been talking about this, even in the Indian market, about the theory and conceptual ideas around how you would control waste discharge from manufacturing antibiotics. This is a standard approach now that can be evidenced on how the safe concentrations of antibiotic discharge in the environment can be controlled. I think it establishes trust between parties, so between the Indian supply chain, manufacturing customers, and their own pharmaceutical customers, and then ultimately also with procurers. Also, I think the thing that's critical is we have gone through extensive evidence of the right qualification of assessors to ensure that the right expertise is brought into this program to actually find issues and to raise nonconformities when appropriate in the certification process. Finally, I would say that procurers, that there's an interested party, so the ones that are driving this is an independent third-party verification that really brings trust in the manufacturing industry's approach to controlling antibiotic discharge. It's a way that's really easy, streamlined evidence. So instead of you having to produce reams and reams of evidence and documentation and calculations, it's one certificate now that you can produce as evidence. And also it gives visibility into the end-to-end supply chain, so connecting both the finished drug product manufacturing and also API. So the manufacturers themselves, yourselves on this call, what benefits would you receive from this? I think it's a more efficient way to show current conformance and best practice related to antibiotic discharge, which I think before it's very much kind of okay, well, show me how, but I'm not really sure how. And this is very much a streamlined way of showing that evidence. That also the certification is one assessment done per product, which ultimately streamlines the process as well. Instead of pharmaceutical company A and company B coming to audit you both to look at antibiotic discharge, this is one assessment that produces a certificate to comply with both customers. And therefore it removes the audit redundancy. And then finally, I think, Mr. Kashuk and I were talking before about, his technical expertise on this area and how right now it's often derived to helping with audits and hosting customer audits. But instead of, some of that technical expertise being focused on hosting client audits, it's now focused on actually evolving best practice and capacity building within your own organization, informing scientific research and also advancing policy issues. So I think that's another benefit to the manufacturing community. So again, thanks very much for the kind of overview of some of the drivers and also some of the value that can be achieved from the certification. At this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to begin and transition us to the second part of this session, which is focusing on the panel and the questions that we have been joined by our wonderful panelists on this slide here today. And the aim of this panel discussion, which I will moderate, is very much to get different perspectives. Two different trade organizations and presidents of those trade organizations are going to give kind of an Indian market context and how this could really help with proof from evidence of best practice related to antibiotic discharge, and then ultimately 2 perspectives from pilot participants who actually underwent the certification themselves, and the value that they see and the process that they underwent to actually achieve the certification through the pilot. And then finally, also from an assessor point of view, we'll have Mr. Vasudeva Murthy talk about actually how and what it takes to actually assess and the key things that we'll be looking for in this process. So again, thank you to all the panel who have joined us today. I'm really looking forward to this part where you're no longer hearing from BSI, but instead from people who are ultimately engaged in this topic on a day-to-day basis. So, Mr. Manjeet Singh, I'm going to start with you, if I may, please, to ask the first question. The first question would be, as a leader of implementing these processes across your business, what challenges have you faced when taking on looking at controlling wastewater discharge from your antibiotic production? And I'll come back to you with the second question after this. So can you highlight some of the challenges, please, Mr. Manjeet?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney, and thank you very much offering me this opportunity to share the insights. Yeah. So let me give introduction about my company. Then I move on. How did we move right from scratch, let us say, till certification? A very exciting journey. For Centrion, it was really ambitious dream to become PNAC compliant, let us say AMR standard compliant and AMR certification. Centrion is UNGA signatory company, and we are also member of Industry Alliance. Okay, so somewhere in 2016, even before, let's say immediately after UNGA sign off, we started working on AMR. In fact, that was something we were, I would say, we were working in lack of any standard or guidance, which later on AMR Industry Alliance brought in. And we had a program called Sustainable Antibiotics. We want to do that. We are really, I would say, leader in producing specific class of penicillin class of antibiotics. Okay, yeah. And 2018, AMR Industry Alliance published CAAMF, that's an antibiotic manufacturing framework as well as a PNAC table, and we started working immediately. We embarked upon let's say a project called PNAC compliance. Okay, so eventually what we saw in 2019, one of a stream of our products became PNAC compliant, and another stream became 2021. Yeah, and in fact in 2023, so eventually we have gone for certification audit, which was our dream, when we started with. So we are now looking for really a coveted certification in our hand, but this entire exciting journey was not without challenges. So I would like to share that challenge we had. I think every industry, every company would pass through those challenges. So it would be good to share that. The first, I think, challenge was AMR was really a new topic. So it was very difficult to know what is this program, how to address it, convincing our management as well as pursuing those programs. Then eventually it was again a challenge, should we add it to our ESG ambition or not? So that was one challenge. We eventually added to our ESG ambition. It is one of our pillar now. Okay. And I think by the time we have CAMF and PNAC tables, so it was really a challenge to assess all our own sites as well as our supplier CMO to assess against CAMF. Okay, then eventually convincing them to let's say go for PAC or PNAC compliance assessment. So that was another challenge. And I think while we were discussing internally which approach we should follow, because we discussed mass balance approach, also a measurement approach and AMR platform. So eventually, being an APIs producer, we said, okay, we usually have a very big losses in API as compared to, and let us say formulation. Let us go for measurement. We would like to have more precise and accurate. Really want to know, where do we lose and how much we lost. So the challenge was which method, what to choose, because there was no method available. So eventually we came across a method, which is EPA method, and it was not plug and play. So we wanted to develop this method, to know the residual antibiotics, which we call PEC now. Okay, so like these limits are very stringent. It's in ppb, and we are in industry used to ppm, right, in our FG. So eventually we started our journey in India, and we could not really find a lab which can help us to qualify, validate this method, a big challenge. So then we shifted to Europe. So there we also, again, we had a 8 month struggle in India, and then we spent another 6 months in Europe to develop this method. When we developed this method, we really discovered it changes site to site, water matrix, the way we treat. So these were, in fact, challenges. Then we have challenged how to do sampling, transportation, preservation of samples, right? Moving from India to, let's say, to Europe, okay? And eventually, then we got assessment. We came to know facts. So what we tried to see, did a risk assessment. Where is the maximum risk? Where we should immediately address? Okay. So we did risk assessment for all liquid streams, and which are either water-based, let's say solvent, or let's say bottom from those distillation columns. All those kind of streams moves out of our factories. Okay, or even being treated inside our factories. And we also did for, let's say, even solid waste. We also do at our end air waste. Those are not, let's say, part of Industry Alliance standard, but it's a kind of looking very forward. Okay. Then challenge was then AMR standard now came into, let's say, published in last year, and having again reassess all our sites, whatever analysis we had as per AMR standard. Eventually we thought we want to go for certification. So how to make a combination of mass balance plus measurement we have, to really bring a solid evidence that we are PNAC compliant. And before that, one of our site which has undergone certification had really very stubborn stream. It was really, really difficult to treat and meet PNAC. And it took really us 2 years to develop a technology, to develop our own biocatalyst, which can degrade antibiotic in a small quantity. You can add to stream, it degrades entire antibiotic of our class. I won't say it degrade to, let us say, chloro based, let's say, other antibiotics, non-penicillin antibiotics. So those were all challenges. And then eventually, after this developing this technology, we could be compliant in 2021, and again developing a uniform methodology, for example, documentation, reporting, when to do assessment, and all that. So those were challenges, across all our own network as well as our CMOs. Our CMOs also do reporting on PNAC to us, spec to us, where do they stand, what kind of method they use. Every year we do that. Okay, this is how I would say, in this journey. Eventually, before I conclude, I would say that the most difficult challenge, formidable challenge, was whether to go for pilot certification or not. The reason being, I was questioned by many times, asked by our leadership, Manjit, are you sure that we would be meeting that? I said, yes, I'm sure. Being at AMR Industry Alliance platform, and a couple of times, into the meetings, BSI, and also on certification, I'm sure. Okay, they said, let's go there. Then eventually we decided to go. We had also a little budgetary constraint, which we also came across, because the certification is very, very important. We thought, we realized it is huge value. Okay, so I would say on April 19th and 20th, our site was audited, and indeed the auditor was environmental expert. He has gone into very deep, gone layer by layer till the bottom, So we were happy when we concluded the audit, and it was a really excellent one. And we now, as I said, we are really looking for let's say, to have that quality certificate, and we would really want to showcase our customer, other stakeholders. Yes, we did it, and that would be really a great encouragement to, let's say, all our other sites where we'd also like to do that. But one thing at the end I would like to say, I see there are about 100 attendees on, let's say, on the call and representing many companies. So I think this journey is in fact very exciting and very important. Being and accountable for producing antibiotics, it's important that we combat AMR to preserve value efficacy of our antibiotics. That's all I would want to really share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manjeet. You have really comprehensive answer there. So thank you. And in fact, you've answered some of the follow-up question and throughout that answer around, the aligning sites and different discharge methods, and sometimes the different durations it takes to prepare sites in order to allow for confidence meeting the PEC, or meeting the PNEC, sorry. So that's really a job well done that you've embarked on. And I guess so.
Yeah, just want to make one comment. It's like ISO 14000 other system, they have really now AMR standard in there, but the knowledge is available, So preparing for this certification, you need to really deep dive into standard, work out action plan, and a very, I would say, a nicely planned and well-structured way. Yeah,
Great,
please.
fantastic. Thank you, Manjeet. Thank you very much. And I'm going to transition to another pilot participant, if I may. Mr. Kushak, thanks again for joining us today. And I know that you were at the coalface as well with the pilots and also embedding this standard throughout your operation, so both in India and also globally. So one of the questions I have is, what were some of the drivers to go for AMR certification, and how did your organization approach the pilot certification, if I may? Mr. Kushak, over to you.
Thank you, Courtney, and I'm very happy that I've been invited as a panelist in this. AMR drivers were not one, but quite a few of them. One of them was that as AMR, it was one of the top 10 global threats, because as per the study of WHO, it has been estimated that there are about 1.3 million deaths that had happened because AMR resistant bacteria. And one of the potential reasons for that is the discharge of effluents or wastewater without proper control it and treatment of it. So we need to understand that as an organization, this certification and being a member of the AMR Alliance, it proactively demonstrates our commitment to this upcoming AMR standard, and also to benchmark the processes that we have vis-a-vis the standard. So that is very important. So there were two basically drivers. One was being an AMR Alliance, we wanted to show support to the standard and also benchmark our processes, and on the greater good, on the greater picture, support this particular AMR, which is a global threat. This initiative, to all the participants, I believe this initiative is also one of the critical steps of defining and driving the implementation of responsible manufacturing practices, which basically helps us to mitigate the impact of AMR on the environment. Now, we had a head start being a member of the AMR Alliance, because precursor to this standard that is being discussed and launched, there was the common antibiotic framework, manufacturing framework, and it gives us a risk-based guidance. So we had followed the mass balance approach. We knew where our losses with the API will be and what was the disposal method that was practiced. So that was backed up when we found out which of the critical steps were generating those losses. We had put some procedures and practices in place, changed them, identified those procedures and practices which were generating those losses, changed those practices, and then reduce the discharge of these antibiotics to our wastewater stream. Also, we need to understand that the antibiotic concentration needs to be below a particular value than the PNEC. And that needs to take account the degradability of these antibiotics in your treatment plant, or if you are connected to a central effluent treatment plant out there, that degradability, and then the volume that get added into the central effluent treatment facility. Also, if the central effluent treatment facility has got a discharge into a river, the lean water flow of that river needs to be taken into account. So with all these calculations, you will come up to a value which possibly will tell you that your PEC value is lower than the PNEC or not. So those approaches were taken by us as an organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kashuk. I appreciate the transparent answer on that. I think the one thing I'll pull out amongst all of the great insight you've provided is the ability to benchmark, yourself and benchmark even between sites and also yourself with other organizations. I think it's a really key output that allows for not only, competitive advantage, but also for an understanding of maturity, right, of where you are in your waste discharge control processes. So thanks, that was really, really insightful. And again, I appreciate the support to embark on the pilot. So there's been really fantastic perspectives, I believe, from two of the manufacturers who have undergone the pilot. I'm going to transition really briefly over to Mr. Vasudeva Murthy as well, and just in line with those pilot participants, and obviously Mr. Vasudeva was one of the assessors who embarked on the pilots on behalf of BSI as an employee of BSI. So Mr. Vasudeva, one question I have for you, if I may, is, how was the experience when assessing this wastewater discharge, and how did you go about taking the standard to actually inform, and the assessment protocol that we've created to actually inform what you looked for in the assessment process? And then we'll go over to the trade association subsequently. Thank you. Mr. Vasudeva, over to you.
Thank you, Courtney. Well, it all started off, in fact, we always try to verify to see that the organization has a kind of an objective to set in, taking in from the elements of the 14,001, because there is the starting journey of any organization as such with regard to it. So do they have any kind of assessment, any kind of methodology that they have with regard to see to it how they can, in fact, try to put this into their systems with regard to it? And considering the requirements of the AMR, which in fact, goes into the actual wastewater treatment as such, because most of the organization today in India, they do have ZLD, and they mentioned stating that, how they are not, in fact, letting out anything out into the river or into the any other waste body systems as such. However, there is something that, where we need to verify to see to it that they follow a process, follow a procedures, see to it that, in their complete batch manufacturing processes at each level, what kind of controls that they have and how these controls have been measured, and see to it that, how they can, in fact, try to control. And the most important part, from the assessing point, we always, in fact, try to look at more on proactive rather than reactive as such. It is more difficult to go and treat when there is more number of your own product which is getting away into the waste streams as such. Instead, can we, in fact, try to see to it at the point of source where we can, in fact, try to see to it that, where we can try to control, and those particular things that, how we, in fact, try to control, and using these standards, using the mass balance or using the other analytical methods that, at that point of source, they could, in fact, try to help them. And that's how, in fact, the organization can get benefit of it, and how they can, in fact, try to improve upon to see to it that the overall objective in trying to achieve not just only a kind of a certification stating that, we've been assessed and then we've got these particular aspects, but it also helps their own organization both financially as well as, giving them a mark in the entire in their own in fact fields and
Thanks.
Organizations as such. Yeah, thank you very much.
Really helpful. Thanks, Vasudeva. I appreciate the insight that you've been able to provide there. And I think it's helpful, hopefully for future people who are embarking on this, that they actually get some insight from the people that will be assessing their organization. So again, thank you very much. Wonderful. So I'm going to bring our last two panelists into the discussion today now, Mr. R.K. Agarwal and Mr. Ashok Kumar Madan. So thank you both again for joining, representing two trade associations of pharmaceutical manufacturers in India. And I'm going to kind of take it up to a higher lens there to give a bit of an Indian market perspective, if I may. So what are you hearing from your manufacturing membership relating to wastewater discharge processes or relating to AMR, and how they're complying with some of the Indian regulatory body, the Pollution Control Board, and what they're looking at showing evidence around wastewater discharge or zero wastewater discharge? Could you give a little bit of the Indian market perspective of what you're hearing from your membership related to this topic of wastewater discharge? So if I may come to Mr. Ashok first, and then I'll go ask Mr. R.K. to join as a second step, please. Mr. Ashok, I cannot hear you. If we could.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I'm representing the Bulk Drug Manufacturers Association, where most of our members are API producers, and most of them are, mid-sized industries. So industry recognizes the threat of AMR, and it's a global threat. Actually, as Mr. Kaushik has mentioned, it's by WHO, it is among the top 10 threats described. So having said this, AMR is a concern for several important reasons, because it makes your treatment process completely ineffective, and it becomes, everything, the basic, you don't have, how do you move forward? So let us look at the possible reasons for AMR, because there are so many reasons described in various literatures, and also Mr. Steve has pointed out certain things. There are some reasons which are relatively easier to implement, to handle, and there are some reasons which requires more technical working, such as this kind of certification program. There are issues related to overuses in the hospitals. They are related to unexpired medicines. They are related to use in poultry. They are related to use in veterinary. They are related to agro, and there are various fields which are in totality contributing to the AMR. So having said this, pharmaceutical effluent is perceived to be one of the reasons, and because it is perceived to be one of the reasons, our association had structured certain studies to find the link between the pharma effluent and the antimicrobial genes, and we have done two studies. One, a short study where it was found that the antimicrobial resistance, what is prevailing near the pharmaceutical manufacturing site, is also present in the similar concentration at a site which is 50 kilometers away and where there is no pharma manufacturing units. All these reports are available on our website. I think anybody interested can look at the reports. Exhaustive reports scanning over a period of 2 years are available, and they are placed on our website. Now, having said this, a certification program initiated by BSI is a most welcome step, and BDMA will welcome any scientific effort made towards controlling the whatever little discharge pharmaceutical industry might be making. So we welcome the launch of this certification program of AMR and would like BSI to provide more details about this certification process and certification program to our members. And this is the first global initiative in this direction. Now, having said this, in India, environmental laws relating to the discharge of industrial waste are very stringent as compared to any other country. In line with the demands and expectations from various stakeholders, the environmental management at API units is assuming very high significance. API units are required to invest heavily in meeting different compliances and operational requirements of the environmental management system. Needless to mention that API units in and around Hyderabad region are in forefront in these efforts. They have been operating proven technologies for almost a decade now. API units adopt zero liquid discharge technology by evaporation of high TDS effluent by using multiple effect evaporators, ATFT, and reverse osmosis plants. Besides, these units have also taken measures such as recycling of mother bigger streams to the previous stages of production, thereby optimizing the generation of the waste. Now, the surveillance of wastewater management by the regulatory agencies is across the API sector. It is at highest level due to enforcement of online monitoring system that are connected to the regional and the national environmental monitoring authorities. So that is the level of environmental monitoring in the country. Most of the zero discharge plants do not discharge any liquid waste outside their own premises. They use it for the secondary use like cooling towers or boiler, and most of the solid waste generated it normally going to the cement plants for co-incineration or for or as a raw material. So this is the level of the industrial compliance at the moment. Nevertheless, we would welcome a certification program and would expect BSI to share the details of the certification program with our members, and members would be very happy to cooperate and to come forward to go ahead with the certification. Thank you very much.
Mr. RK, thank you very much for that insight and for the landscape that you've talked to. And again, I appreciate the openness to your membership to learn more about the certification. And I think Natasha's presentation at the end will hopefully give some further detail on how to achieve certification. Before we transition to Natasha, Mr. Ashok, I would love for you to also speak to how this certification will impact your membership and some of the landscape of the Indian market around that, please.
Quickly, thank you for this. Now, taking further from what Mr. Agrawal has mentioned, our two associations, the VDMA and IDMA, are almost working in unison on the issue of the APIs as well as the formulations. The IDMA is an association which has a membership of more than 1,100 members across the country, comprising small, medium, and the large enterprises. Now, when we look at the environmental standard and the implementation by the authorities, we will be concerned when we are coming to the certification. We definitely welcome this launch. This is going to facilitate the entry of the new entrants also. But we would like to know, as far as our small and medium enterprises would be concerned, as to how much would be the cost of the certification, how much time it will take. Maybe the way Mr. Agrawal has mentioned that we will be needing more details from BSI. So the details can be percolated down to our members, and they would understand that their needs are being taken care and their exports and entry into the new areas would be facilitated. So this is what we are looking for, and definitely it is a good effort and we laud the effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Madan. Thank you very much. I appreciate that insight. And again, I think hopefully in this final session, we're going to be able to provide some details around, the preparation, the duration of the assessment, therefore some of the indicative commercials around this. So without further ado, I just want to thank everyone for their wonderful time on this panel and for the wonderful insights and perspectives that we were able to achieve from the voices that were given. So thank you for manufacturers, assessors, and trade associations to give those different lenses. So I will end the panel, and finally we'll go to the last section of today's agenda, which is over to you, Natasha, to go around the technical overview of the certification and how that would actually be achieved by manufacturers.
Wonderful, thank you, Courtney. Lovely. Right, so let's first of all focus just on a high level overview of the certification, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail. I would just frame this before I go into it, but what we can do following this webinar, if you complete the survey at the end, is we can pick up in more detail with individual manufacturers, and obviously I'd welcome the opportunity to speak further to some of the groups, as was mentioned in the panel as well. So first of all, the certification program itself is based on the AMR Industry Alliance publicly available standard in its entirety, and that can be downloaded from the AMR's website, and we'll be providing links to that after this webinar. We then draw on the international best practice for environmental management based on ISO 14001, but very specifically to the scope of the manufacture of antibiotics and antibiotic waste, either solid or liquid. Now, what's really important to say at this point is that this certification program does not require certification or even compliance in its entirety to 14001. Now, the reason for that is that some areas of 14001 would be completely out of scope for this particular certification program, such as greenhouse gas emissions or energy usage. So we're just drawing on some very specific requirements of 14001 to frame the system that you have in place. The areas that we're focusing on are in the areas of planning, including environmental aspects of liquid and solid waste containing the antibiotic residue, and compliance obligations. Vasudeva spoke a little bit there about operational planning and the controls that are in place, and also your preparedness and your response in case of an emergency. We'll be looking at the monitoring and evaluating of the performance of the system, and then finally looking at the continual improvement of the process and of the controls itself. And you can see at the screen there, and we've touched on it through some of the panel, that we would be looking at the predicted no effect concentration levels, and that's the test itself, and we would be validating the method that's been selected, whether that be mass balance, and or sampling analysis or zero liquid discharge. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, just to provide you with, what does the framework look like for becoming certified? So the assessment itself focuses on the process steps for the product which has been applied for in the certification process. So the certificates can apply to an API or a finished drug product individually, or it can be applied to both where they've been manufactured at the same site. And every certificate issued will represent one site, but could have multiple products on the scope of that certificate that have been produced at that site. Now, the initial assessment itself starts with stage 1, and this will be conducted virtually. This is where we assess your procedures and we confirm the intent that the products being produced will meet the requirements of the certification programme. So it includes areas like a review of documentation related to regulatory requirements and permit conditions. We'd be looking at risk assessments related to the antibiotic discharge. Again, the panel touched on that in terms of some of the pilot participants' experiences. And we'll also be looking at the quantification method being used, being compliant with the certification programme as well. Another area that we would be looking at is the maintenance plans for things like equipment and the environmental controls that are in place. Now, once we've done that stage 1 assessment, you'll receive an assessment report, and any findings that have been identified will be reported to you. And we would then conduct an on-site assessment. That's our what we call the stage 2 assessment, and that's where we're assessing the effectiveness of the procedures. So we'd be assessing the manufacturing process. So we'd be conducting a site assessment, including looking at storm collection. We'd be looking at on-site wastewater treatment if that's on the particular site, waste storage and wastewater collection. If there's deep wells on site, we would be observing them, underground and above ground, storage tanks and piping, warehouse, physical storage, primary packaging. So we'd be looking at the end-to-end process. And we'd be conducting the test of the programme, and this is where we evaluate adherence to the PNEC as determined by the selected method of mass balance, sampling analysis, or zero liquid discharge. And it's really very common in all certification programmes that we identify non-conformities where requirements have not been met. And what would happen there is any non-conformities will be raised. They'd need to be investigated to understand what the root cause of those non-conformities are, and a corrective action plan would need to be put in place to prevent reoccurrence. And dependent on the severity, this might mean further assessment time is required, or you might be able to just submit that evidence to us and us review that and accept that evidence. Once a certificate is issued, an organisation will then move into an ongoing surveillance plan. So there'll be assessments conducted annually to ensure the ongoing compliance. And if you're not manufacturing a particular campaign, we'd be looking at a reduced assessment, looking at your capability to meet those requirements for future campaigns. Now, certificates themselves can be suspended and ultimately can be withdrawn if an organisation demonstrates that they are unable to meet the requirements. I would say that that is rare, and the reason that is rare is due to the robustness of that initial assessment programme that's been put in place by the organisation, but it is there to kind of protect the integrity of the certification programme itself. Now, I touched on there at the beginning that we're looking at a one-to-one approach with these certificates, so a API and or finished drug product at a single site. Now, we believe that this one-to-one relationship that we've set the certificates up will enable organisations to focus on key products first and focus on particular sites first, and then be able to scale rapidly as their system matures, and as they're able to. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit now about supply chain transparency. And this is where Courtney touched on earlier, so, some of the key drivers in this particular area in terms of having that independent verified evidence of you meeting the requirements of the scheme. So as a manufacturer, you will be able to supply your certificate as part of tenders. And what I've got on the screen now is an example certificate, which is displaying where a API only has been added to the scope of this certificate on page 2. So you would be able to provide this as part of your tender documentation as evidence, and it's very clear which drug product is under the certification programme and which site that product is being manufactured at. Now, if we move to the next slide, the next kind of stage to that process is to further enhance supply chain transparency. Independent validation can also take place on that certificate. So if we now put ourselves in the position of being a procurer who's perhaps performing some due diligence, they can then validate the certificate, and they can do this in 2 ways. So if your certificate has been sent to a procurer, that procurer can then perform a live check. So your certificate has embedded within it a unique code which takes them to a live check onto our BSI validation portal, where they can confirm it is a live and valid certificate. Or they can search for the certificate in the portal itself using your name as a manufacturer or your Kite Mark license number. An added benefit to this is if you are a manufacturer of an API or finished drug product and you've successfully achieved certification, you would also get access to a portal which is specific to your organisation and confidential to your organisation. And within this BSI client portal, you would be able to view your certificate, you would be able to see your assessment reports within that portal and your future assessment dates. You'd be able to benchmark across sites. So as you start to build up your number of sites that are certified and your certificates that are issued, you can start to benchmark findings across sites. But you can also monitor your supply chain as well. So you can set up an alert within the portal which alerts you to the ongoing status of your supply chain certificates as this certification builds. So perhaps you are producing the finished drug product and you have an API at a different site or with a different organisation altogether producing that API. You would be able to monitor that certificate is still live, so that you would be able to evidence kind of the full supply chain as well, should you wish to. So to summarise, the value of certification itself comes from this robust approach to programme development that we shared at the beginning, and then that in-depth and continuous assessment programme that we undertake with organisations. And then finally, the transparency it then provides to the supply chain with the ability that they can then go on to view and validate certificates. So I'll now pass back to Courtney, where I think we're going to get into some Q&A.
Great, thanks, Natasha. I hope that starts to give some really good insight into what technically will be covered in the assessment process and ultimately how the certificate can also be used. So really valuable information there. The final slide of the presentation before we could take a couple questions, so again, please do use the chat box, is just what's next? What advice would we give you all for understanding how to embark on certification? So the first step, I think, would be to download the Antibiotic Manufacturing Standard and understand what the requirements are from the standard by reading through and understanding how you would show conformance to the PNEC and how you would calculate the PEC. And that ultimately is, again, the key measure with which we're going to be assessing you. And also, we're going to be able to provide you a client guidance as a result of this as well. So once you register the interest, as in step 2, you register your interest to learn more about the certification process or begin an application for becoming certified with BSI, then you're also going to receive the client guidance that outlines this assessment process, how we would actually embark on auditing the organization, and ultimately, again, what would the requirements that sit behind that as well. And then step 3, I would say, is it's starting to inform relevant stakeholders, both internally and externally, to really understand and vocalize your intention to become certified and the value that that can bring to your organization. So read the standard, register your interest, and then inform relevant stakeholders. That would be the key next steps. So I will stop now sharing my screen. And again, thank everyone for attending. We have received quite a few questions in advance of this session today. So in the final 5-7 minutes, I picked out a few of those questions. If we don't respond to your answer today, we will follow up in the question and answers as a follow-up one-on-one after this session as well to provide those responses. So the first question is, what is the driver for the industry and why would they opt for the certification? Is it getting regulated by the government? It's a good question, and hopefully throughout the presentation, both and the panelists, that they talked about some of the drivers and how is it linked to regulation. So I think, to me, this is a further independent third-party view that you're able to actually prove that you have the right wastewater discharge control processes in place. So the drivers would be kind of twofold, I think. One, obviously showcasing your customers and also your customers' customers that you have the right waste discharge controls in place. Right now, there's this loop that I find with Indian manufacturers, and there's zero liquid discharge models and their pharmaceutical companies' customers. And this loop that goes back and forth saying, well, how are you managing control of your waste in the antibiotic manufacturing process? And then Indian manufacturers say, well, there's a zero liquid discharge model. And they say, the manufacturers say, well, how about a mass balance? Can you show us your mass balance? Well, it's a zero liquid discharge model. And there's this loop that kind of circles back and forth between Indian manufacturers and their customers. And I think what this does is allows for that third-party independent view to issue a certificate and allow you to meet your customer requirements. So that would be, I think, driver number 1 is independent proof and evidence that you are indeed having the right wastewater discharge controls in place. And then the second piece I would say is also potentially the financial investment community or financial funding who are looking at sustainability as a key part to achieve sustainable investment. And this is, again, one of those key principles that attracts financial investment, and independent certification is a really good proof point to obtain that. And then I guess relation to regulation. So I mean, the Pollution Control Board is independent of BSI, and they will continue to inspect and enforce the regulation that's in place. I think this is more from a kind of commercial advantage and proof of an external validation to achieve commercial advantage with your customers, and also as a further evidence to the Pollution Control Board that you have the right controls of the wastewater from your facility. So this would probably be the answer to that question. Anything else to add, Steve, from your side on answering that question on the drivers? Or?
Well, yes, only to add that, I mean, there have been discussions of regulation. You know, many people on the call will know that there were discussions around regulations in India that didn't come to pass. But also in the European Union, there's discussion around proposed pharmaceutical legislation, revised legislation that would require manufacturing risk assessment for antimicrobials, which this would fit, I think, very nicely into actually for the antibiotics. So the regulatory perspective it's never too far from the sort of the agenda, as it were. But what we feel strongly is that all the steps that have been described today are steps that would be helpful to any company manufacturing antibiotics in the event that regulation were to come into place, whether that's in India or in another country into which antibiotics are supplied. So we think we're doing the right thing, and I'd like to think that companies would feel inclined to learn more about this approach, and hopefully, of course, seek certification once they're comfortable with the requirements.
Thank you, Steve. I'll go on to the next question that's been submitted. The next question is, I would like to know, this is someone who has 25 years of consulting on environmental issues with the Indian healthcare sector, that he would like to know if AMR certification is for people, as in personnel certification, or if it's for organizational systems related to antimicrobial control practices. And he believes that the market needs both personal certification as well as organizational system certification. So, I mean, the answer is both. To answer the question directly, what will this entail, the certification? The first is the product certification, that is actually certifying the antibiotic and that the right discharge processes and controls are in place. The subsequent step, which we're in the process of developing and finalizing, is the personal training program, that you would actually get personal certification to show that you have been trained to the standard and ultimately to best practices related to antibiotic waste controls. So that absolutely will be the subsequent step, is both personnel certification in addition to what's launching today, which is the certification for products.
Yeah,
Natasha, anything on step?
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say it's really important that people understand, unlike say ISO 14001, which is certifying your operations at a given site or organization, this is very specifically focused on the product, how that product is made at that site. If you make the same product at two different sites, you'll need two certificates because your management system may change, but certainly the conditions around your discharge will highly likely be different between site A and site B. So I just want to emphasize that point. Sorry, Natasha, I know you probably have something to say as well.
No, I think you covered that there, Courtney, with regards to the training. That's something that we're looking to deploy, and that should we'll be sending out news about that shortly.
Great, thank you, Natasha. And then interestingly, we've got quite a few questions coming in around how do you calculate the PEC, or how can you show conformance? And I would strongly, again, encourage people to download the AMR Industry Alliance standard that very much gives values and understand how you would arrive at that calculation. And that will be, again, one of the major things that we're going to be reviewing in the certification assessment process. So I strongly encourage and we'll refer people to this industry standard as a way to actually understand how you would calculate the PEC. I think Manjeet and Kashuk outlined that very beautifully in their responses to the panel questions and how they've achieved that. So hopefully some good advice came through today's meeting as well. So I'm cognizant we're at the top of the hour, so I just, well, halfway through in India, sorry. So we're finished with the time allocated to today's session. And I wanted to very much thank everyone for the questions that were submitted, the interest and engagement, the panel discussion, and also to the Industry Alliance and to BSI as well for all of the engagement and technical development to get us to the point we are today. So strongly encourage everyone to continue to ask questions of BSI and ultimately register interest for certification. And thank you very much, and I wish everyone a well day for the rest of the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.